Now, the plant in nearby Amherstburg that bottles Crown Royal, an iconic Canadian whiskey with a storied history, is closing and shifting work to south of the border.
Shock and sadness in Amherstburg. The Crown Royal bottling facility is closing.
So this is what I think about Crown Royal. That's what they could do. And I think everyone else should do the same thing.
He's annoyed over parent company Diageo's decision to move a bottling plant to the United States.
A name that once defined Canadian craftsmanship is packing up and leaving home. Crown Royal, the whiskey that carried decades of national pride, will no longer be made on Canadian soil. The move has shaken a community that built its livelihood around those distilleries and left many wondering how things unraveled so fast. While Premier Doug Ford vents his anger in front of cameras, the real problems behind the exodus remain untouched. And it raises a question few are ready to face. How did one of Canada's most iconic exports slip away so easily? Amherstburg was never a place that needed a spotlight to prove its worth. The town's pride was built quietly, bottle by bottle, inside the Crown Royal plant that shaped its economy and gave generations a sense of direction. That factory wasn't a symbol on a map. It was the thread that held an entire community together. Then one announcement changed everything. The doors would close, the jobs would vanish, and the work that once defined the town would be moved to the United States. Overnight, the heartbeat of Amherstburg slowed, and hundreds of lives were thrown into uncertainty. What made the news harder to process was that nothing inside the plant had failed. The whiskey was still selling, the brand was thriving, and the demand was stronger than ever. Yet none of that mattered when the numbers no longer worked in Canada's favor. Around 160 workers suddenly found themselves without a future, not because of poor performance, but because the environment around them had grown too heavy for business to survive. Rising costs, endless taxes, and complicated regulations have turned production into an uphill climb. Companies like Diageo, Crown Royal's parent company, reached a point where staying in Ontario no longer made sense on paper. The official statement from Diageo spoke of streamlining operations and optimizing the supply chain, polished words that softened the reality. The truth was simpler. Producing in the United States was cheaper, faster, and easier. Illinois offered lower taxes, fewer hurdles, and a business climate built to attract manufacturers. The decision may have been described as strategic, but it felt like abandonment to those who spent decades keeping that plant alive. What began as a local tradition of craftsmanship had turned into a casualty of modern economics. The United States, over the last several years, has reshaped its economy into a magnet for production. It made decisions that welcomed industry, cut red tape, and prioritized efficiency. For companies like Diageo, that shift was hard to ignore. Saving millions of dollars was no longer a question of preference. It was survival. So, while the whiskey itself will still carry the heritage of Canada in its branding, the paychecks will now cross the border. The soul of that label will remain Canadian, but the work behind it has quietly changed hands. In Amherstburg, the closure left more than an empty factory. It tore through generations of pride. Parents who once passed down jobs to their children now have nothing to offer but memories. The words, "We bottle Crown Royal here," once carried weight. Today, they sound like part of a history lesson. And while operations in Quebec will keep a small portion of production alive, it feels more symbolic than real, an attempt to hold on to a national identity that has already slipped away. When the closure was announced, the reaction across the country was immediate. The brand has been a part of Canadian life for decades, woven into celebrations, milestones, and quiet family gatherings. Crown Royal wasn't only whiskey, it was a reflection of Canadian craftsmanship, a small piece of the country that people could take pride in. So when news spread that bottling would move south, it struck a nerve that went deeper than economics. It felt personal, as if a piece of Canada's identity had been quietly traded away. Premier Doug Ford stepped in, vowing to fight for the workers. His frustration played out in front of cameras as he smashed a bottle of Crown Royal in protest. The gesture drew attention, but did little to address the core problem. The truth is, outrage can't rebuild lost jobs. Canada's business climate has been tightening for years, and while Ford's anger captured the mood of many Canadians, it didn't solve the question that started all of this. Why are companies finding it so difficult to stay? Behind the scenes, the logic was painfully simple. The United States offered better margins. Diageo's decision came down to a difference of roughly $8 million in labor savings. To a multinational corporation, that's a minor adjustment. To Amherstburg, it's the difference between survival and decline. Generations of skilled labor, loyalty, and history were reduced to a line in a corporate balance sheet. The language of efficiency replaced the language of community, and those who built the brand from the ground up were left behind. On paper, Crown Royal remains Canadian. The bottle still wears its purple bag. The label still tells a story of royal roots and northern pride. But in practice, the identity has shifted. The hands that once filled each bottle no longer belong to the same country. The factory lights that once glowed through Amherstburg's nights will soon fade for good. That gap between appearance and reality defines this moment, when something that looked permanent revealed how fragile it really was. This story isn't isolated. It's part of a wider pattern where multinational companies look beyond borders for cheaper labor and smoother operations. Canada's strength once rested on its ability to keep industries rooted at home. Now it faces a growing challenge as businesses measure loyalty against the cost of staying. The Crown Royal decision might be one company's move, but it carries a warning for others watching closely. If the conditions don't change, this won't be the last departure. Amherstburg's loss reaches beyond economics. It touches the cultural fabric of what it means to build and keep something that feels like your own. Crown Royal wasn't only a source of income, it was a shared accomplishment. Something that told the world Canada could create products respected everywhere. Losing that sense of ownership leaves behind more than unemployment. It leaves behind a quiet emptiness that no statement or slogan can replace. The most difficult part for those affected isn't the closure itself, but the realization that their work can continue elsewhere without them. The whiskey will still be poured, sold, and celebrated, but the story of the people who made it has been written out. That's what makes this loss heavier than a business decision. It's the moment when a country sees the limits of its own promise. Doug Ford's outburst captured national attention, but in many ways, it symbolized the helplessness leaders feel when reacting to something that should have been prevented long ago. No amount of anger can offset policies that push businesses away. And while calls for boycotts and outrage fill the headlines, the people of Amherstburg face a far quieter reality: the search for new work, new purpose, and a way to rebuild what was taken from them. Crown Royal will continue to thrive as a brand. The bottles will keep their royal purple bags, their golden crowns, and the familiar taste that connects generations. But what once made that whiskey a Canadian triumph is now split across borders. The company's loyalty moved with the savings, and the workers who carried that legacy are left watching from the sidelines. Moreover, while Canada was tightening regulations, raising energy costs, and layering new compliance rules on top of old ones, the United States was heading in the opposite direction. Over the past decade, American policymakers have built an economy where production isn't hindered by red tape, but encouraged through opportunity. Lower corporate taxes, cheaper energy, faster approvals, and a government that sees industry as something worth protecting have turned the U.S. into a magnet for business. This isn't political theory, it's a financial reality measured in profits, payrolls, and growth. When Ontario's Premier, Doug Ford, confronted Crown Royal's executives, he tried to find a way to keep them in Amherstburg. He asked what incentives could convince the company to stay and save those jobs. Their answer was blunt. There was nothing Ontario could offer that could match what the U.S. already had in place. The comparison wasn't emotional, it was arithmetic. On one side of the border, each passing year brings more costs, more waiting, and more rules. On the other side, companies find flexibility, predictability, and room to grow. The border didn't move, but the advantages did, and Crown Royal followed the logic of business survival. In Amherstburg, the BMNAD announcement landed like a thunderclap. The Crown Royal plant wasn't a factory on the edge of town, it was the town's core. It employed generations of families who built their lives around its rhythm, the shifts, the steady paychecks, the sense of security that came from knowing the work mattered. The government's response to this crisis revealed a different kind of problem. When the shutdown became public, Ford took his anger straight to the cameras. He stood with a bottle of Crown Royal, poured it on the ground, and promised to remove the brand, and even Smirnoff, from Ontario liquor stores. It was a made-for-TV moment that drew applause from some and criticism from others. The display looked like defiance, but it did nothing to bring back jobs or reopen doors. Anger filled the airwaves, but not a single new policy addressed why businesses were leaving in the first place. While Ford played the role of the fighter, another key figure said nothing at all. Mark Carney, once celebrated as the architect of Canada's economic stability, offered no explanation, no roadmap, no reassurance. His silence spoke volumes. It revealed how unprepared the country's leadership was for an industrial shift that has been building for years. One leader shouted without a plan, another stayed quiet without accountability. Both failed to provide the directioners Canadians were waiting for. Mark Carney's silence during this fallout exposed the gap between policy theory and reality. His framework had once been praised for its stability, but it wasn't designed for an economy competing with an aggressive neighbor willing to cut costs and taxes to attract business. When the first major brand left, it showed how fragile that framework had become. Carney built a model that worked on paper. The problem is, economies don't live on paper. They live in towns like Amherstburg. As the United States strengthens its position with incentives and stability, Canada faces a choice: rebuild the confidence that once kept industries rooted at home, or keep watching them leave one by one. The difference will depend on leadership that values solutions over sound bites, because at this point, no amount of outrage or slogans can undo what's already begun.